Here's the most important question you will probably never be asked in school. Are you here by accident or on purpose? Darwin said that you are here by accident. Jesus said the exact opposite, that you were made intentionally, that your life has weight and significance, and that the God who created the universe knew your name before you took your first breath. These two ideas are not compatible. They cannot both be true, and the answer you land on changes literally everything about how you see yourself, how you treat other people, and what you think happens when you die. So let us actually look at the evidence and settle this properly. Darwin's core argument was actually simple, and that is part of what made it so compelling. He said that living things change over time through a process called natural selection. Yet animals that are better suited to their environment survive and reproduce. Animals that are not suited to their environment die off. Over millions of generations, this produces enormous change and eventually entirely new species emerge. When he sailed to the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that the same species of tortoise had developed completely different shell shapes on different islands depending on the food available to them. It looked like a simple and elegant explanation for the variety of life on Earth. Jesus, on the other hand, never debated biology, but he did say something that puts him in direct conflict with Darwin's worldview, and the clash is impossible to ignore. Jesus affirmed repeatedly that God created humanity intentionally, that human beings are not biological accidents but are made in the image of God, and that every person has inherent worth and dignity because they were designed that way. Darwin's world says you exist because generations before you adapted and survived. Jesus' world says you exist because you were lovingly intended and created. Now, those two ideas cannot both be true at the same time. Either your existence is the result of a blind, indifferent process that does not care whether you live or die, or your existence is the result of a creator who made you on purpose. That is the real question sitting underneath all the fossils and the scriptures, and the answer you land on changes everything about how you see yourself and how you treat other people. Darwin's followers did not stop working after he died. For 150 years, scientists kept building the case, and some of what they found is genuinely remarkable. The whale is probably the single best example. On the surface, a whale looks like it has nothing to do with land animals, but when scientists looked closer, they found vestigial hip bones buried inside the whale's body, remnants of legs that no longer exist. Whale embryos actually grow tiny leg buds during development before they disappear, and the nostrils start at the front of the face before migrating to the top of the head to become a blowhole. Fossil species like Myocetus were discovered with both land walking legs and swimming adaptations, sitting right in the middle of the transition, and when scientists ran the DNA, whales turned out to be most closely related to hippos, a land animal that also gives birth and nurses underwater. 4 completely independent lines of evidence, anatomy, embryology, fossils, and genetics, all pointing to the same story. That is not nothing. That is genuinely impressive science, but here is where Jesus's framework quietly holds its ground. The Christian worldview does not actually require a young earth or a world where every species appeared in its final form overnight. What it requires is a creator behind the process, and the deeper scientists dig into biological complexity, the more they find something that blind chance struggles to explain. Consider the fact that a single-celled amoeba, supposedly one of the simplest organisms on Earth, carries more DNA than a human cell. The internal machinery of a living cell involves thousands of precisely timed chemical reactions, all happening simultaneously, all interdependent, all necessary for the cell to function at all. Remove any one of them and the whole system collapses. Darwin's theory explains how existing life adapts and changes over time, but it has never produced a satisfying answer for how that first self-replicating cell appeared from non-living chemistry in the first place. Jesus said there was a mind behind the beginning, and the more science probes the beginning, the more that looks like a reasonable claim. Here is the moment where the debate completely shifts in Jesus's favor, and it is not even close. Darwin's theory is a biological theory. It was designed to explain how species develop and change, and within those limits, it does a reasonable job. But human beings do not only ask biological questions. We ask questions that biology was never built to answer. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why do I feel a sense of right and wrong? Why does injustice make me angry even when it does not affect me personally? Why do I love people in ways that go far beyond what survival would ever require? Why does a beautiful piece of music make me feel something that has no survival value whatsoever? Darwin's framework has no answer for any of those questions. It was not designed to have one. Jesus, however, answered every single one of them directly. Where does morality come from? From a God who is himself the standard of right and wrong, who wrote that standard into every human conscience so that even people who have never read a Bible still know that murdering children is evil. Why do we love? Because we were made by a God who is love, and we reflect that nature whether we acknowledge it or not. Why does life feel like it should mean something? So even to people who claim to believe it does not, because at some deep level, the design is still visible even when the designer is denied. Darwin explained the machinery of life and left every important question about life completely unanswered. Jesus explained why the machinery exists and who it was built for. And when you line those two things up next to each other, the gap between them is not small, it is total. So here's where we land. Darwin was a careful and intelligent man who made real contributions to science, and evolution as a biological framework deserves the serious engagement it has received. But Darwin's theory was always limited. It can tell you how a whale lost its legs. It cannot tell you why the whale's existence matters. It can trace genetic lineage back through millions of generations. It cannot tell you whether any of those generations had any significance beyond their survival statistics. Darwin gave us a description of life, Jesus gave us the meaning of it, and in the end, description without meaning is just noise. There's also one more thing we're saying plainly. Darwin observed a natural world full of suffering, competition, and death, and he had no framework for why any of that was redeemable. He looked at the cruelty of nature and could only conclude that cruelty is simply how things work. Jesus looked at the same broken world and said it was not supposed to be this way, that something had gone wrong and that he had come to fix it, not to explain the suffering, but to bear it and to defeat it. Darwin offered an observation. Jesus offered a rescue. And if you are a human being who has ever suffered or loved someone who has suffered, you already know which one of those two things you actually need. The evidence points toward a creator. The complexity of life points toward a mind behind it. The hunger for meaning that every human being carries points toward a source of meaning that exists outside of biology. And the historical record of a man who lived without sin, died without deserving it, and by every account of his earliest followers, walked out of a tomb 3 days later, points towards something that no evolutionary theory has ever been equipped to address. Darwin explained the world he could see. Jesus claimed to be the author of the one he could not. And the case for Jesus, followed all the way to its end, turns out to be far stronger than the culture ever told you it was. Subscribe for more!